Hi there, and welcome back to another video. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to create a PowerShell application that will keep track of the progress of the Team C's initiative. Now, Team C's is an initiative started by Mr. Beast and Mark Rober that plans to remove 30 million pounds of trash and plastic from the ocean by the end of the year. Now, they already have over $12 million donated to this initiative, which will remove over 12 million pounds of trash from the ocean, and that is awesome. But let's say that you want to have a live, up-to-date watcher of this progress. Well, in this video, I'm going to show you from start to finish of how you can create this application that will give you the live pounds removed or the live donations made, along with the recent donations and their comments. Now, if you have not watched Mr. Beast's video that have started this initiative along with Mark Rober's, I highly recommend you go watch those two videos. And if you just want the application that I just showed you and you don't really care about learning PowerShell, well, I do have this available on the Microsoft PowerShell Gallery, so you can install it directly from the PowerShell Gallery. And I have instructions on my GitHub, which I will link in the description below. And it's pretty much just running 3 commands that will allow you to launch this GUI directly from PowerShell. But if you do want to learn how to create GUI applications in PowerShell, this is a simple one to get started with, and I'll show you from start to finish on how I created this. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab this whole web page and store it in a variable in PowerShell. So let's call this variable web page, and then let's do invoke web request and give it the URI of the Team C's web page. So let's put this in double quotes. Alright, and now that we have it stored in the variable, let's see what's in the variable. And if this pop-up comes up, you can just click no. It's just asking about a cookie. And here you can see that we have a lot more information than we really want. All we want is the total donations and a list of the most recent ones. So to make our life easier in parsing this web page and grabbing this single value, we can use the dev tools built into a web browser. You can open up the dev tools by clicking F12 and open this up. You want to open up Inspector, and then you can pick an element from the page. So if we click this, we can choose this right here, and it will give us the line of code that is displaying that information. So here we can see that this is a H1 element, and it has an ID of live counter. So let's go ahead and copy that ID. Once we have that ID copied, let's go back to our PowerShell window, and then let's type out our variable, and then we're going to want to get the property parsed HTML, so we can do that, and then we're going to want to use a method on this called getElementById, and then we're just going to paste in our ID that we got from the web page, and then we're going to hit enter. Now again, this is going to give you a lot more properties than you probably need, but if we scroll up, we can see that the outer HTML is what we saw in the web browser. However, it's showing 0 right here, so this is a problem. So it seems that they put a 0 as kind of a placeholder, and they probably use a script to give it that little animation that you see whenever you refresh the page and it starts counting up. But this value that it ends up with must be coming from somewhere. So let's go ahead and go to the network tab of the DevTools. And then let's see if we can find anywhere that talks about maybe a live counter or the total pounds. Okay, so I'm going to move this up, and then let's just look to see if we can find anything that resembles the information that we're looking for. And here we can actually see donation total right here. So let's see what the response is whenever they called that. And here's that number. Okay, so let's, instead of calling invoke web request on this URL, let's go ahead and call it on this, which looks to be tscache.com. So let's just right click on this, and then we'll do copy URL, and then let's go back to our PowerShell window and let's do invoke web request again, and this time let's store this in a variable called total donations, and this time we're going to supply it with the URL that we just copied and hit enter. And now let's see what's in our variable. So here you can see that we have content and we have the count, and this is the number that we saw on the web page. So this is perfect. And I'm not sure if you noticed, but right under the total donations, there's actually LB recent. And this kind of sounds like their recent donation. So let's go ahead and copy this URL as well. And let's do the same thing. So let's do just recent, do invoke web request, and then give it the URI, click enter. And now let's see what's in this variable. So here we can see that it does give us an array of all the recent donations along with the messages and the amount of pounds that they gave. I mean, the amount of dollars that they donated. Now, this is still giving us a lot more information than we really need. Really, we just need the content. So let's go ahead and try to use another command line called invoke rest method. So I'm just going to do recent, and I'm going to do invoke rest method, and I'm going to give it the same URL. And then let's see what's in this variable. And here you can see that the value that we got from invoke rest method is just the value from the property content when we ran invoke web request. So now that we know how to get the information that we're looking for, let's go ahead and turn these into functions so that we don't have to remember the URL, and we can just call a function in PowerShell that will automatically give us the information that we want. So let's go ahead and move over to VS Code so that we can start writing our functions. Now I have already created some folders that will be used for organizing our application that we make. So the public folder will be where we put the public functions that we write that can be called upon by the end user. The private folder will be functions that will only be used by other functions in our module, and ones that don't really need to be called by the end user. I'll get to WPF in a second, and then formats we probably won't need, but this is where I normally keep my format files for my functions to make the objects look prettier when they're shown to the console. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our first function. This will be a public function, and we're going to name the file the same name that we give the function. So we're going to do get, and I'm just going to do a little prefix of TS, team C's, total donations, and then it's going to be a .ps1 file. And now in order to write a function, the first word that you need to write is function, and then the name of the function. So this is going to be get TS total donations. And then we're going to do some curly brackets. Now, whenever you're writing functions, you should always include this little line right here, which is command-lib binding. This will allow you to use common parameters and gives you other features, and it just does no harm by adding it, and it only makes your function more advanced. Now, if you do add this, you do have to add the param section, even if you don't have any parameters for this function. Now I can't think of any parameters that we currently need, so we're just going to go on with the function, and we're just going to basically copy in what we had to get the total donations. So we're going to just copy this line right here. We're going to paste it in, and instead of web request, we're going to do rest method. Alright, and then let's just see if this works as expected. So in order to test this, we can just click F5 and it will run everything that's in this PS1 file. So now that our function is loaded into this PowerShell window down here, we can call it. So we can do get TS total donations. And here you can see that it ran this command. However, it put it under the property count because that's what's returned from this method. But really we want that property to be called total donation. So let's go ahead and modify our functions to have this property called total donation. Now the first thing that we want to do is put the object that was outputted right here into a variable. So let's put that into a variable called total donations. And then we'll want to create our own PowerShell object with the property that we want. So let's go ahead and start typing out PS custom, and then VS Code will automatically give you this IntelliSense, and so you can hit tab. Now the first thing on the left side of the equal signs will be the property name and then the value that we're going to give that property. So the property name will be total donations, and then the value is going to be in this variable under the property count. So let's go ahead and type that out. So we're going to do total donations, and then we're going to do count. So now let's go ahead and hit F5 again, and then let's run the command. And here you can see that we are now getting an object with the property total donations and the number of total donations. Let's see if we can make this object that we're outputting a little bit more interesting. So we know that the goal for Mr. Beast and Team C's is to get 30 million pounds removed from the oceans, or $30 million worth of donations. So let's go ahead and do a percentage of how close they are of completing their goal. So the next property that we want to add is probably the goal, and then the goal is 30 million, so that'll be 3 and then 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Let's go ahead and get rid of those spaces, and then we'll want to do percent complete. So let's do percent complete. And here we're going to be using a .NET class called math. In order to call a class, you're going to want to do the square brackets. We're going to do math, and then we're going to do the static method on this class by doing 2 colons, and then we're going to do round. Now the first parameter that we're going to give the round method will be the number that we want it to round. So in this case, it's going to be total donations divided by the goal. So I'm going to do, again, total donations dot count divided by 30 million. And then the second method, we're going to separate the parameters. The second parameter that we're going to give it is the number of decimal places that we want it to round to. So in this case, I want to round to 2, and then we're going to do a closing parentheses. Okay, so let's go ahead and click F5 again, and then let's run this command. So get ts total donations, and here you can see that I forgot to times by 100. So right now it's at 0.37. So let's go ahead and do times 100, do F5 again, and here you can see that we're at 37%, the goal is 30 million, and right now it's about 10.9 million that has been donated. So here you can see that we actually have the value 30 million twice in 2 different places, and these will always, we want these 2 values to always be the same, so really we would want to put this in a variable and then put the variable right here instead. But this could also be a parameter, so we can change the goal when we run this function. So let's go ahead and make this parameter. So this will always be an int value, so I'm going to do make it cast it as an int, and then we're going to do goal as the name of the parameter, and then we're going to give it a default by doing the equal sign and then 30 million. Okay, so let's go ahead and replace these 2 right here for the goal variable. And then you can see that if we run the command again, it will give us the same thing. However, now we can change the goal. Let's do, I don't know, 15 million. And here you can see that we'll be 73% done if the goal was 15 million. Okay, so now let's turn the recent donations into a function as well. So I'm going to right click and create a new file, and let's call this get ts donation, and let's call it donation info, because if we look back at the object that they gave us, it actually contains a lot more information, and we don't necessarily want to get rid of all this information because we could use it later on. Now there would be no problem doing get ts donation recent donations and just grabbing this property here, but I'm just going to leave the object as we got it. So let's go ahead and do the same thing. Okay, so now that I've created this function, I'm going to hit F5 to load it in. And I'm going to do get ts donation info, and here we have that object that we saw in the console. Now you might be thinking that this function is overly simple, and it's true, it is, but you always want to make a function do one thing and one thing only, and even if it's really simple, whenever you start creating more complex applications or modules, it makes it much easier for you to debug the application or module if each function is very simple. Now we could call this something different, like get donation details or something else. Maybe get donation info is not the best name, but it works for now. So now that we have all the data that our application will be using, we can start creating the graphical user interface. And we're going to be using WPF, or Windows Presentation Framework, in order to create the graphical user interface, or the GUI. Now we could use WinForms, but that's very outdated, and I highly recommend learning how to use WPF to create your applications instead. In order to create a WPF GUI, we'll want to use Visual Studio 2019. If you don't have this installed and you do plan on creating GUIs in PowerShell or in C#, I highly recommend installing the Community 2019 version. It is a great tool and I very much like it. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my Visual Studio 2019. Once this is open, I'm going to do create new project. Okay, so the template that we're going to use is WPF app, and I'm going to do .NET Framework, If you don't, you won't see it under your recent project templates, so you can go ahead and search for it right here. So you can just type out WPF and it should pop up. You can see that there's actually WPF .NET Core, and then there's also WPF .NET Framework. Now .NET Core is cross-platform, however we're not going to make this application cross-platform, so we can choose .NET Framework. So I'm just going to click on that and then click Next. We're going to name this application, so I'm going to call this PS Team Cs. I'm just going to have that, leave that checked, and then I'm going to do Create. Okay, so we should be presented with two different sections, one with the GUI and one with the code underneath. I usually like to put them side by side, so I'm going to do this little split so that my code's on the right and the representation's on the left. Before I get started in creating the GUI, I will like to say that in order to really get a jump start on how to use WPF and how to write it and just get the feel of it in general, I highly recommend watching this video by I Am Tim Corey. It's the video that I first watched whenever I started doing WPF, and it helped me tremendously. I really don't think you should just go into it blindly, and this is the perfect video to start. With that being said, let's go ahead and go back to our application, and I will leave a link to this video in the description below. So going back to our application, the first thing that we should do is maybe rename this title to Team Cs. And here you can see is that it changed this right here. And then I'm just going to change the width for now. We'll probably change this again later. All right, so the first thing that you will notice is we already have a grid element in our application, and this will contain the entirety of our application. So we want to split this up into columns. And let me go ahead and make this text a little bit bigger so that you can see. Okay, so we're going to do grid.column definitions, and then we're going to do column definitions, and then here you can actually just do the slash and it will close it out. Now we're going to give this column definition, I like to give it a border, so I'm going to do width of 5, and then I'm just going to do Control-C, Control-V twice. So now that we have two columns on both sides of our application, that will serve as basically a automatic border. And then in between this, I'm just going to do an asterisk, which means that whatever in this column should take up the rest of the application width-wise. So now that we have our columns, let's go ahead and make our rows. So we're going to do that by doing grid dot row definitions, again row definition, and then again with rows, I'm going to do a height of 5, and then I'm going to copy and paste that 4 times. So the top two are going to be 5, and then these two will be asterisks. So that means that each section, each row will take up equal portions of what's remaining. So we have 2 rows now. The top row will be where we put our total donation summary, and then the bottom row will be where we put the list of recent donation. So the bottom row will actually contain more information. So let's go ahead and give a max height to the top row. So I'm going to do max height, and I'm going to give it a value of 150 for now. Okay, so now that we have the general layout of our application, let's go ahead and put elements into our little grid section. So I'm going to create 2 group boxes and make sure that you're above the end tag of grid. And I'm going to do group box. I'm going to give the first group box a header of progress. And then I'm going to tell it which row and column that I want to put it in. So I'm going to do grid dot column and then do 1. So the columns actually start at 0, so this column of 5 will be 0, the second column will be 1, so that's going to be this middle column right here. And then I'm going to tell it which row I want, so I'm going to do row 1 as well. So this is going to be that row right here. And then I'm going to do a little bit of margin so that it has some space around it, and I'm going to do 5 as well. I might add on to some properties to this group box later on, but that should be good for now. Let's go ahead and create the second group box. So we're going to do group box. We're going to give this the header of recent donations. And then we're going to give it the row and column as well. So row or column 1, and then the row of 2. And I'm also going to give this a margin of 5. Okay, so we have two group boxes. Now let's go ahead and start it to see if this looks how we want it to. And here we can start to see the power of WPF and just how dynamic it is. So these little asterisks, as I said, will fill up the rest of the application with the elements inside those columns or rows. So here, if we expand the column, you can see that the elements expand as well to fit that entire column. If we expand vertically, you can see that this is already at its max height, so it won't expand. However, the second row, or the third row technically, will keep on expanding because it has that little asterisk right there. Now if I make it smaller, you can see that once it gets below 150, it will actually make these two equal. We could play around with this a little bit more, giving each one maybe a minimum height, but for now this should be good. Okay, so let's go ahead and start filling in our first group box, which is going to be our progress summary. So we're going to want to include the total donations along with the percentage that's completed. So I'm going to do a stack panel since we're not going to have that many elements, and we're just going to want to stack these one on top of each other. So a stack panel will stack either horizontally or vertically, and I'm going to indicate the orientation to be vertical so they stack on top of each other. And then I'm going to close that out, and then inside this element I'm going to put a text block. This text block will show the total number of pounds that we have removed, so I'm going to give it a placeholder text of, I don't know, 10,000 or 10 million, just so that we can see how it looks. And then I'm going to give it a font weight of bold. I'm going to increase the font size to 30, and then we are going to want this to be in the center, so we're going to do horizontal alignment of center, and then do a slash, and we can close it out. And I would say that looks pretty good for now. The next thing that we'll want to do is maybe create a little separator. So we will do separator, do a slash, and you can see that created a little horizontal separator. And then below that, we can get a little fancy and we can make a progress bar and put the progress completed in the middle of that progress bar. So in order to do that, we're going to have to create a grid element and then place the progress bar and the text block in the same grid. So we're going to do progress bar, and I'm going to do a little mock value of around 50, and then we're going to want to give it a height of, I would say, 50. I'm going to do a margin of 10 to give it a nice little padding around itself. I'm going to change the background color to azure, and then the foreground color to, I think, aquamarine. Let's make it a little bit of a sea color. And then last thing, let's go ahead and give this a name. So we're just going to call this progress bar, and then close this out. And then next we're going to want to create the text block. We're going to bind the text of this text block to the value in a second, but for now I'm just going to give it the same value of 50. We're going to want to make this centered, so we're going to do vertical alignment center and horizontal alignment center. And then let's go ahead and make the font weight for this as well to be bold, and the font size to be, I don't know, 20. And then I would say that looks pretty good. And we are going to do a little bit of changing to have the little percent mark and to have maybe pounds removed after this as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the recent donations group box. And inside this group box, we're just going to have a single element that is a list box so that we can list out all the recent donations. So we're going to have to supply this with the item source, but I'll do that in a second. So the first thing I'm going to do is give it a name. I'm going to call it recent donations LB for list box. And there's a couple properties that I'm going to set, and I'll explain why later. So the first one's going to be horizontal alignment is going to be set to stretch, and then the second one's going to be scroll viewer horizontal scroll visibility equal to disabled. In short, what this does is ensure that each list box item fills up the entire width of the list box, because sometimes there'll be different widths and we want them to be all uniform. So the next thing that we want to do is create a template so that we can design how each list box item will look. So we're going to do list box item template, and then we're going to do a data template. So this data template will be a grid. Now I'm only going to have 2 rows, so I'm going to do grid row definitions, row definition. The first row will have a height of auto, meaning that it will just take the height of the elements within inside it and nothing more. And then the second row will be the remaining of the space that is left. So this will be height of little asterisk. And then I'm going to create two stack panels. The first stack panel will be on the top, which will list the user and the amount that they donated, and the second part will be the message. So I'm going to do stack panel. Oops, I need to get out of the row definition, go down one. So I'm going to do a stack panel with the orientation of horizontal. And then inside the stack panel, I'm going to do two text blocks. I'm going to just do some mock text right now. So I'm going to do John. And then the second text block is going to be 5 pounds. And let's actually just make it the amount donated. So I'm going to do $sign. I'm going to close that out. And then the second stack panel is going to be a vertical one. And then here we're going to add a separator. And then another text block. And this text is going to have their entire message. So I'm just going to write hello world for now and close that out. Now we will be binding each one of these texts to the list box item, and I will be showing you how to do that soon, but I just wanted to keep the design part very simple before we got into another concept. And I just now realized I need to indicate which row each of these stack panels go on. So this one will automatically be the first row, but I'm going to go ahead and indicate that I want it to be the first one, so that will be 0, and then the second one will be grid.row1. So now that we have finished a rough draft of the application, let's go ahead and try to import this into PowerShell and then be able to launch this graphical user interface through PowerShell. Okay, so let's go back to VS Code, and then we're going to create two new functions. One's going to be a private function and one's going to be public. So let's go ahead and create the public function. We're going to do show PS team C's, create a PS1, and then we're going to do function, give it the name that we gave the file, which is team C's. Always do the commandlet binding. Even if you feel like you don't need it, I would always recommend adding this. We'll give it the param, and then so this will be the function that we actually use to launch the GUI, but we first need to import the YAML file that we created in Visual Studio. So the way that we will do that is by creating a new private function. We'll call this import YAML, and I just copied over the private function that I use in all my GUI application modules. And so I'm not going to go into great detail of how this works, but we do need to add the assembly of presentation framework and basically create some new classes that are XML namespace and YAML reader, and then we load it. So now we can call this function and show PS team C's, and then we're going to store what it outputs in main window variable. So I'm going to do import YAML, and then the parameter is path to YAML. So that's going to be the path to the file that we created right here. And I'm going to copy that file into this folder WPF. So let's go ahead and create a new file right here. I'll also call this main window, and then the file extension is YAML, and then I'm just going to go over here and just copy and paste it into this file. And then there's actually one modification that we need to make. We need to delete this right here, and we also need to delete the line MC ignorable. We could actually probably automate that process in the import YAML, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it manually right here. And then I'm going to save this file, and then we're going to give it the path here. So in order to get this path right here sort of dynamically, we can use some automatic variables that the module has, but we haven't finished making the module, so I'm going to just paste this in manually. So this is going to be the path to this right here, but I'm going to create the variable that we're going to use later on. So this is going to be path to YAML, and our automatic variable is going to be my invocation, my command, module, and then module base. And then we're actually going to do a command called join path. So that's going to be the first, and then the child path will be WPF, and then main window. And basically, once we finish creating the module, we will replace this right here with this variable. But for now, I'm just going to comment that out. And then once we have this in the variable, we're going to do main window and then show dialog. Also, when all this is in a module, this will be automatically imported, but for now we have to manually import it. So I'm going to click F5. And then I'm going to manually import this, click F5, and then I'm going to do show PS team Cs. And then here you can see that it got launched right here. So now we have access to the graphical user interface, but now we need to basically bind the data that we can get from these two functions to certain elements in this GUI. So in order to bind the data that we have to certain elements in the GUI is to create a main view model, or that's the easiest way in my opinion. So let's go ahead and create a variable called main view model, and then we're going to create a custom PowerShell object with the properties that will define our data. So one of the data that we need is the total donations, and then we're going to set that value to the output of the get TS total donations. So we're going to do get TS total donations, and then the next thing that we want is donation info. So we're going to do donation info, and then we're going to do get TS donation info. So now that we have our main view model, let's go ahead and make this accessible to our GUI. So we're going to do that by setting the main window's data context to our main view model. So now let's bind the total donations property of our main view model to the property that shows the total number of donations in our GUI. So let's go back to Visual Studio, and then here you can see that this text property is what we need to change. So we're going to delete that placeholder, and we're going to add in some curly braces and then do binding. And then we're going to give the path to the property that we want to set it to or bind it to. So we're going to do total donations, and then we're actually going to do dot total donations again, because you need to remember that in our main view model, this is the first property, total donations. So that's going to be this right here, but that property has an object returned from this, which also has a property called total donation. So it's a bit redundant, but for now, that's what we need to do. So let's go ahead and save this or copy it over, and then I will load it again. Okay, so I realized I had to fix a couple of typos. So for the get total donations, I was missing an A right here, so I had to add that. And I just now realized I did PS team Cs, so let me rename that to TS like the other ones, and then let me go ahead and fix this as well. Okay, so I'm going to hit F5, and then let's go ahead and launch this. So it's going to be show TS team Cs, and now you can see instead of some random number that I just put in there, it's going to be the actual value from the website team Cs. So we're getting some progress here of getting the actual data in our GUI. So let's go ahead and do the same thing for the progress, and then let's see if we can get the recent donations in a list box. Real quick, before we add the binding to the %complete, I realize this times 100 right here should actually be within these parentheses, because if you run it how it was, so if we just run this, we can see that we get no decimal places, we just get an int value. However, if we load this into it now and then run it, you can see that we get 39.14, which is what I had in mind. This stuff kind of just happens since I am creating this module as I'm recording. So anyways, let's go ahead and bind this to our %bar. Okay, so let's go back to Visual Studio, and then for the progress bar for the value, let's go ahead and do the binding, and then we're going to do path total donations and then the % complete. And then for the text, we're going to bind it to the value of the progress bar. So to bind this text value to the value property of the progress bar, we're going to do something similar. We're going to do curly braces binding, and instead of path, we're going to do element name first, progress bar. We're going to do a comma, and then the path to the property on the progress bar, which is value, and then we're going to do another comma, and we're going to do string format. So we're going to need to do open and close curly brace, and then another open curly brace, 0:0, and then we're going to do the %, and do I have one too many? I believe so. So I believe that should be good. And yes, you can see right here that the value of the progress bar is currently at 0, and it's showing 0%. So that's exactly what we want. And now let's go ahead and bind the other properties, such as the item source property on our list box. So this is going to be the list of the recent donations. So we're going to do item source equals binding recent donations dot recent. And you actually don't have to do path equals, it just assumes that, but I'm going to just to be extra clear. Okay, so now each object within this list of recent donations is going to be bound to each of these little data templates. So now we're going to be talking about the properties on the individual objects. So for the text, we're going to have to look at the actual objects that were given. So let's go ahead and go back to get TS donation info, and I'm just going to open up PowerShell again, get TS donation info, and then the one that we want is recent. So let's go ahead and expand out the recent property. I probably should have selected the first one. Alright, so here we want to get the name property, we want to get the pounds, and then also the message public. Okay, so let's go back to Visual Studio, and now let's bind these text blocks. So the first one will be the name of the user, so let's do binding path name, and then the next one's going to be the pounds, so let's delete this and then do binding path pounds. And then finally their message, let's delete out hello world and do binding path, and then I believe it was message underscore public. Okay, so let me go ahead and copy this back over to our VS Code file, and then we'll launch it and see if everything lines up accordingly. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch it after I copied over the updated file, and here you can see that the % got updated, however the list did not show up. So I think I might, yeah, see, so this says recent donations, and then if we look at the main view model, it's actually donation info, so I just mistyped that. So let's go ahead and fix that. I'm going to click save, and then let's run this again. Okay, perfect. So now you can see that each item in that list of recent donation is in our list box. However, it doesn't look quite pretty. You know, maybe this would be better if it was centered. Maybe if the pounds and the name were a bit further apart, and maybe if there was a border. So let me go ahead and go back to Visual Studio, and I can show you how you can change all that. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to want to change or add is probably a border. So let's go ahead and do a border around the grid. So let's do a border. Let's give a border brush of, let's do dark blue. Let's keep a bunch of blue color maybe, and then let's do a border thickness of, let's just do 1 for now, and then we'll have to copy the entire grid and place it within the border. Okay, and then for the text blocks, let's go ahead and add a margin, but we don't want to add a margin all the way around, we just want it on the right side of this text block. So we're going to do 0, 0, and then I'm going to do 10 and then 0. So the margins start from the left, top, then right, and then bottom. So let's go ahead and copy this over to the pounds text block, except let's move this to the left. So I'm going to do 0 right here and then do 10 right here. Okay, so I decided to update quite a few properties and just show you all at once. So the first one that I updated was the horizontal alignment for the list box. Originally it was just horizontal alignment. It needed to be horizontal content alignment, or else it won't let the list box items fill up the width. The next thing I changed was the corner radius of each one of the boxes, just to give them a more rounded edge. I added a margin. I also added donated and a $sign to the pounds that were donated. I added a separator between the name and the amount donated, just to give it a little bit of spacing. And I made a width of 5. I also added a data resources, so this allows you to kind of set multiple elements at the same time. So I just did a style, a target type of text block, and I wanted to set the horizontal alignment to center for all of them. And the last thing that I did was set the horizontal alignment for the stack panel that's horizontal to be center as well, because these were not being centered. So once we do all that, and then we go back to VS Code, and I can go ahead and launch it, you can see that it pretty much looks how I want it to look. I mean, some coloring could be done better, maybe like the background being a darker gray, the list box being a different color. But here you can see that, you know, we're looking at all the data that we want to look at, and we can see the message, the amount donated, the person who donated it. Now the next thing that we kind of want to do is make this feel like it's being updated in real time. So the way that we can do that is get all the recent and just add them one by one, and then also have that each donation be added to the total, and then grab it every time you run out of the list from the first query, and then go on from there. Now in order to do this, it will require a little bit of extra work, because we're going to need to do this in a different run space, or basically a different thread than the graphical user interface. And then we'll also need to create a specific object that will allow us to update this property and it to be passed through to the GUI from the other run spaces. So let me just walk you through how to do all that. Okay, since there's a lot of moving parts when we are working with multiple run spaces, I decided to go ahead and write out the rest of the code, and I'm just going to walk you step by step of what each part does and how it all fits together. So we're in our main function that launches the GUI, show ts team Cs, and the first thing that we want to do is basically create a synchronized hash table that we can put objects in and access those objects from the different run spaces. So we're going to be putting our main view model in the synchronized hash table so that we can access it from the separate run spaces. Now, in order to insert that hash table into the new run space, we are going to have to create an initial session state, and we're just going to create a default. Now, the next thing that we need to do is do a session state variable entry. So this basically inserts this synchronized hash table into the new run space. So this is going to be the name of the variable in that run space. This is going to be the object that that variable is going to reference, and this is a description of that object. I'm just going to have it as null. And then once we do that, we're going to add our variables to our initial session state right here. So the next thing that we want to do is create a run space pool, and this allows us to quickly and easily create new run spaces as we need them. So in order to do this, we're going to call upon the run space factory class and use the static method create run space pool. Now the overload that we're using can be found on the documentation page. So the first parameter is going to be the minimum number of run spaces, which has to be equal or greater than 1. Then the second one is going to be max run spaces. In my case, I know that we only need 2 at most, so I'm going to do 2. And then the next parameter is going to be the initial session state that we created up here, so that we can basically insert that variable, the synchronized hash table, into this new run space, to each run space that we create with the pool, and then the host is our current host. Now there's a couple properties on this run space pool that I want to ensure are set, which is going to be a single thread apartment state, and then I want to reuse threads, meaning once one run space has completed with a script, it can be reused by another one. And then we're going to open up that run space. Now these next two lines right here are actually going to be the new list that we're going to be adding our recent donations to. I'll actually explain this a little bit further, but you can just essentially think of this as the list that we're going to be adding the recent donation objects to. And then here we've already covered where you're creating the main view model. So here we're getting the total donations, and then I'm adding the list that we created right here. And then we're going to add this main view model to our synchronized hash table right here, so we can access it in the different run spaces. And then we're also going to add another property to our synchronized hash table, which will be the root of our module, so that we can access the different functions in our module in different run spaces. Okay, so now that we have everything set up to start creating new run spaces, I have created a new function, a private function that we can call that will generate a run space that will update our data that our GUI is showing. Now this will output a run space. I store it in a variable called data update run space, and then I set a property on this run space, the run space pool property, to the run space pool that we want to add it to. And then once we've done that, I just start the run space and it starts running all the code that I have set in the script of this run space. So now that we have our data run space running, we can go ahead and launch our GUI. So you can see here that I've swapped out the hard-coded path to our main window file with the one that uses the root of the module and then basically combines it with the WPF folder in the main window YAML file. And then we just go ahead and import the YAML and set the data context like we did before, and then I'll do show dialog. And then once we're done with the application, if you close it, we're going to want to stop the run space that we created up here. We want to close it and dispose of it. So let's go ahead and look at some of the other functions that I wrote, starting with the new update data run space. So if we go to our private folder and go to new update data run space, we can see that we're using the Powershell class and the static method create, and then we're going to add a script. So basically everything in this script will be ran when this run space is invoked. Now the first thing that we want to do is set the error action preference to stop, because if an error happens in this and it's not caught, then the GUI will actually freeze up. So you actually want to make sure that all errors are at least caught and somehow dealt with. So in this case, I want to be able to see what the error was. So that's why I created another private function called show message box, so that a little message box will show up when an error occurs and we can see what it was. And I can see right here that I actually did UI instead of data. So this is the data run space error. We want that to be the title. Now the next thing we want to do is add the assemblies that we'll need. So this will be the presentation framework. We actually don't need this, but sometimes I will use WinForms objects as well. So I tend to add it just in case. And then we'll want to basically import all the functions of our module. So normally with private functions, your other functions have access to them when you call them. So show TS_teamC should have access to our private function, which it does right here. However, since we're now in a new run space, this run space doesn't know that it was called upon by a certain function. So we're going to have to import these private functions manually. So that's why I have getChildItem, and that's why I added the module base to our data hash. So here you can see that the data hash is our synchronized hash table that we can now access in this new run space. So I'm basically going to import module, which imports these functions for our private, public, and classes. Now, if you have the module installed, this line might not be needed, but I currently don't have the module installed on the computer. I'm just manually importing it when I need it. And then the next thing that we're going to do is run another private function called update TS donation data, and we're going to pass it the view model that we want to update. So let's go ahead and look at the next private function, the update TS donation data, and see how we are updating the data that's being shown in the GUI. So if we go to this function, you can see that it has two parameters, one that we use, which was the view model. The second one I'll talk about in a second, which is the list length. So the first thing we want to do is basically grab the most recent data. So we're going to call our two public functions, get donation info and get total donations, and we're going to store them into variables. Here you can see that I'm only grabbing the recent property on the donation info. Now the next thing we want to do is basically subtract the sum of all the recent donations. Alright, 1 second, Future Cyrus here. So I had a slight mistake in this section right here. I had forgotten to do the dash sum parameter, so it was subtracting essentially nothing. So it was just giving you the total donations and then adding on even more. So it was more than what it was supposed to be. Alright, back to the video. From the total donations, because we're going to be adding the recent donations one by one, and so we're going to want to add the amount of pounds that they donated individually to the sum as they're being added to the list. That'll make more sense once we launch the GUI and you can see how it works. Now the next thing we want to do is now update the total donations to the total donations minus the sum of the recent donations. And then the next thing that we're going to do is basically iterate through all the recent donations one by one. So we're going to add the individual donation right here to the total donations, and then we're going to insert this donation into the list at the index of 0. Now we could be adding it to the list using the add method, but that adds it to the end of the list, so it will show up at the bottom of the list. We want it to show up at the top of the list as it's being added. The next thing that we want to do to basically control the length of the list is if it's greater than the list length that we set up here, which is going to be 50, then we're going to remove the last item from the list. So we're going to do remove at, which is we're going to pass it the index that we want to remove the object at, and that's going to be basically 1 minus the total count on the list. So it's going to be 50 minus 1. We do the -1 because lists always start their index at 0. So if you have 50 items in the list, the last item is going to be 49. The next thing that we want to do is kind of create a randomness effect of how these donations are going to be added. So I decided to do a start sleep and then do a random number of seconds between 2 and 10. This was for testing purposes, but really I think I might change this from like 10 to 60. Just so that we can space them out and we're not calling on the website too much to get more information. And then after this has been completed, we're basically going to do some recursion and we're just going to call the same function again. And so when this gets called, we're basically going to be starting at the top again and then running in a circle until basically this run space is stopped. And this actually needs to be updated because I added the parameter list length. So I'm just going to pass it PS bound parameters. So PS bound parameters is an automatic variable that contains a hash table of the parameters that were supplied to the function. So that way that we're always supplying the same parameters that we started with. Now the last private function that I added was of course show message box. This is just basically a wrapper around this show method of message box just to make it a little bit easier and clearer whenever I need to create one. Okay, so now there's only a couple more changes that I made, which included creating a C# class, and I'll explain why I had to create this class in a second and demonstrate the purpose of it. And I also created a module so that we can import the module a lot faster instead of importing these one by one. And if you want a good explanation of what's happening in this module file, I recommend going to this link here. This is a modified version of what they have, but they do a good job explaining exactly what's happening. Now with that being said, let's go ahead and import this module. So let's do import -module psteamcs, and then let's call our function show tsteamcs. And now that this has been launched, you can see that the list is being updated. However, you can see that as these items are being added, the total is not changing. And this is why I actually had to create that class that I showed you earlier. Now I don't have it implemented because I wanted to show you that this property will not be updated unless we create that class. So let me go ahead and close this out and explain what's happening. So first, let's go to the function that we're using to grab this information, which is get TDS total donations. And here you can see that we created a custom PowerShell object. Now this object, whenever we change the value of certain properties like total donations, this change is not relayed to the WPF GUI. So it has no way of knowing that a change has occurred and to update the value. So what we need to do is create a new class that will use an interface that basically tells the WPF GUI that a property change has occurred. So if we go to the class file, we can add new C# classes by using the add type commandlet. And then here we're basically using a bunch of different namespaces that are required. So if you do plan on using the iNotify property change, you'll have to include all these namespaces. And now let's just quickly walk through what this class is doing. So essentially, grand overview, we're basically translating this PowerShell custom object into a proper C# class that is using the iNotify property change interface. And what this interface does is ensure that you're using methods to allow WPF to know when certain properties have changed. So the first thing that we need to do is create a private property for each of the public properties that will be changing. In our case, it will be all three. We aren't really changing the goal property, but let's say that we wanted to create settings in this application, that setting could actually change. So I added a private property for goal as well. So we have a private property for total donations, % complete, and goal. And then we also have a public property that we can actually access on the object. And the first one's going to be total donations. We have to specify that this is going to be an integer value. So whenever we call get on this property, we're going to get the value stored in the private property of total donations. And whenever we change this property or set it, we're going to set that value that we give it in the private total donations property, but we're also going to update our % complete property by doing a little calculation that we did right here. So we're basically saying, like, every time we change total donations, we can automatically calculate % complete. So let's go ahead and do that upon every time we set this to a different value. And then once we do that, we call onPropertyChange method, and this basically tells WPF, like, hey, this property has changed, go ahead and update the GUI. Now we do this for each of the properties. So here we have a public property of goal, and we just do a simple, set the private version to the value that we give it and call onPropertyChange, and we do the same thing for % complete. Now the next two items here are basically boilerplate items that you're going to be using for any class that uses this interface, the notify property change. So I just copy and paste this whenever I'm creating a class that uses this interface. And this basically creates the method that we're calling on property change to tell WPF that a property has changed. And the last thing that we have is a constructor. So we're saying you can create this object by giving it the total number of donations and the goal, and then from there it will calculate the % complete. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our total donations function, and then let's erase this out of here, and instead let's create an instance of the class donation overview by using that constructor, by giving it the total donations and the goal. And now that we have that updated, let me save it, and then we're going to import our module again and then launch it. Okay, so let's do import module, and then let's do show TS team Cs. And then you can see now, when every time an object is added to our list, the total donated is going to be updated for our total donations here. So every time this property changes, WPF knows, and it updates the value that it's showing us. Okay, so now that we have that cleared up, let me explain why we are using a certain type of list to add these total donations to. So I'm going to exit out of that. I'm going to go back to show TS team Cs, and instead of this observable collection list, I'm going to just do a generic list. So I'm going to comment this line out here and this one as well. Okay, so I'm going to create the same variable, recent donation list, and then I'm going to put a generic list in this variable. So system.collections.generic.list, and then the type is going to be object, and then I'm going to do new. All right, and then now I'm going to import the module again, and I'm going to do show TS team Cs, and then here you can see that even though things are being added to the list, nothing is showing up in our recent donation list box. However, if we slightly change the width or just the height of it, you can see that, it does get updated. So WPF is running into the same problem. This value is getting changed or updated, but it's not showing that change. So that's why we have to use a special list for WPF to basically show the change as the list is changing. So let me go ahead and close out of this and then explain, how this other list works. So I'm going to delete this old one. And in order to use this type of list, you actually do need to add the presentation framework assembly as well. I forgot to add this in the beginning, so I added it later on. But here you can see that we're just creating a list like we did before, but instead of system generic, we're doing system collections object model and then observable collection, and then we're making the objects types within this list just generic object, and we're just creating new. So if we did this and we try to add the recent donations in the other run space, we'll actually run into the error because you cannot add anything to this list on a different thread. So in order to get around this, we can use a static method on the class binding operations called enable collection synchronization. So this basically allows the list to synchronize between different run spaces. Now this does not mean that this list is thread safe, but it does allow you to add items to the list on different threads from where it was created. So here we are giving this method the list that we created up here. The second parameter is something called a lock object. I'm not going to go into what it is right now, but you can basically just create a new object and that will satisfy that parameter. Okay, so let's go ahead and import the module again and then launch it with this updated list. So now that everything should be working exactly how we want it. So I'm going to do import module and then show TS-TMCs. And then here you can see that as items are being added, we don't have to change the window size at all, for it to show up. And then as they're being added, this value is also changing. Now there's obviously a lot of improvements that we can do. For instance, we can better format this right here by adding commas and then pounds removed, and I'll probably do that after this video. And then also the spacing and the coloring on all this, and you can just go wild with basically how you want to design the graphical user interface. But I hope that you learned something in this video. I went over a lot. This wasn't supposed to be an in-depth guide. It was just supposed to be more of entertainment and hopefully kind of give you a general idea of how you can create a WPF application in PowerShell. Okay, so just for a quick update, in order to get the commas for the total donations, we can do the string format and just do 0:N0, and this will give us the commas, and then I also added pounds removed. And for the progress bar, I wanted the decimals as well, so I had to remove the :0. I'm not sure why I added that. So now if we launch the GUI, we can see that we get commas, which is nice, and we get decimals. I was planning on adding how to basically detach the GUI from the PowerShell console that you launch it from, because you could see when we launched the GUI, we can no longer use the console, and there are ways to basically detach it completely where you can close the PowerShell console and the GUI will stay up. However, this video is getting pretty long, so I'm just going to leave it there. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned something. Alright, bye!